All right, I'd like to call this Assembly Committee on Homelessness meeting to order. We'll go ahead and start with introductions, starting with Mr. Peterson.
Pete Peterson, Assembly.
Forrest Dunbar.
Suzanne LaFrance.
Dick Train.
Felix Rivera.
Terry Light, advocate.
All right, and then Mr. Constant will join us back in a second. If we can go ahead, go through the audience and introduce ourselves, please, for the record.
Sean KCB.
Ryan Silva. Joshua Spring with the Office of Senator Tom Leggett. David Redford with Brother Cancer Shelter.
Josh Pepper with Means Cafe.
Anthony Villa Cook in the Tribal Council.
Jason Dawkins at the Mayor's Office.
Steve Ashman, Department of Health and Human Services.
Police Freeland Municipality Research. Rose Salazar, Mayor's Office. Beth Wilson with the Division of Behavioral Health. Linda Chase, Take Back Our Community.
Russ Webb of South Addition Residence.
Lisa Aquino, Catholic Social Services.
Christopher Constant, Anchorage Assembly.
All right. Before we move on to that one business item, I wanted to take the chance to add an agenda item. At yesterday's meeting, I decided to rescind my amendment, and thankfully Mr. Gates was able to quickly put forward an ordinance. So I'd like to review that ordinance regarding informing community councils about zone abatements, and I think we have some administration folks here to talk about that. All right, so we'll go ahead and start. I will turn it over to you, Mr. Constant.
Thank you. Yeah, so some of you might remember maybe a year ago I proposed the idea of creating a homeless community council, a place where individuals who actually experience homelessness or have in the recent history self-organize and speak on their own behalf, because while it's great to have the nonprofit advocates and the assembly advocates and all the people advocating on their behalf, the missing voice is the people themselves. And so Terry is a guest here to the committee and friend who is an advocate and an organizer from the kind of northwest, south of here, from the homeless or houseless community. And so really this is a conversation about how to self-organize and what that might look like, and how we can move forward on that idea, because we're missing a critical voice at the table. So, Terry.
Hi. My experiences has been homeless, and as well as helping organize for other houseless folks. I come from Portland, Oregon, and I've also experienced what Seattle has been doing with its organization of 10 cities and indoor shelters that was organized outside of the city but within a contract with the city. Self-organization is really, really important. If they're going to do anything that's going to work, their voice needs to be in the room. It's discouraging to me when I go to meetings and I hear the word they. It's discouraging to me because it's separating. And the experience of the houseless person is not in the room. And there are a lot of reasons why I feel like providers often don't know what the experience is either, unless they've had a lot of extensive conversation in a place where there was no need for a houseless person to subvert their own needs in order to get the basic needs they need. And a lot of the emotional needs or mental needs not always in the room. The things that I found that made things work in Portland was the history. One of the basic histories was the beginnings of a street paper, where street folks were starting to sell their own papers and also write their own stories. Out of that came people who started going out to houseless people and organizing them, and they created a whole shopping cart brigade. And they lasted, I don't know how many sweeps that happened, but they stayed together. They won their fight with the city and they started Dignity Village. And that was where I lived at when I came to Portland. And I lived there because I had no services for myself. I'm a transgender man, and in Portland, as good as it was, there was no safe place for me to take a shower in a shelter. And when I lived in Village, people left me alone, and I left them alone. And I saw healing in that place because people were talking to each other and trusting each other, where they had lost trust with the city, with healthcare providers, especially not seeing the police as protection, not seeing the city as protection, not seeing their neighbors as a refuge. All the people around them who have so much, they were not the source of refuge for them. And there is a lot of history that goes into an individual that puts them out on the street. Many, many stories of trauma, rejection. Me coming from GLBTQ, a lot of rejection. To be put in this place of throwaway. I feel like that's our first mistake with human beings, is that we can throw a human being outside of our structures. But the Mother Earth is taking care of them. They have a place to sleep as long as they're hiding away from other human beings until they find other human beings that they can talk to. And one of my experiences here, I did live here in Anchorage for about 15 years. And I worked in the community of recovery of mental illness. We have one of the greatest peer support groups of any of the states. I feel like here in Alaska, statewide, our peer support for other people who are experiencing mental illness is one of the best organizations in the states. And our lead in that is the company group called Ionia, which started out with homeless, psychotic people who were traveling around together, supporting each other, looking for help, looking for healing, looking for safety. And they got a they got a homestead, and they started living together. Today, they are a source for families to go there and seek healing. So that's one of the powers of peer organizing. People who understand each other can help each other. And I would just say that if you go and get an idea about what it's like to be homeless, all of a sudden you're carrying something that your neighbors don't want to be around for some reason. You've dropped off a cliff, knowing and understanding what that is to be like homeless. One of my friends at Advocates talks about, tonight, go home. Every half hour, have the alarm wake you up. Take your backpack that you have next to your bed, walk around the block, come back, try to go back to sleep. Because that's the number one problem for a lot of people, is they're not getting enough sleep. And that's some of the reasons why people camp together. Security is number one in a healthy encampment. The organization in Portland has gone through years of evolution. But security was one of the biggest features and agreed upon functions of an encampment. Where they had encampments and they got moved, sometimes R2D2, they have all the statistics around that. When they moved, crime went up by a very significant event. And I can look that up, but it's over 20% crime went up, just because they were not there doing security. They had so many women who come there because they're seeking help from being battered. Quite a few people came in there just to sleep it off because they didn't want to drive home. But these are kind of outreach things that happen. I have one story of a friend who's an EMT, but he's homeless. They heard gunshot down the street. He ran over there. And somebody had holes in their gut by bullets. So he did first aid. And then police came along. And they pulled him away from that patient because he was homeless. And it's like, I don't know why that policeman did that. But I feel like one of the biggest problems we have is the communication factor. Experiences need to be shared. I'll leave you this last bit. This is information coming from Finland. It's called Open Dialogue. You can look it up online. And in that region, they eliminated schizophrenia from the region by a very significant amount. Because they came up with some very specific guidelines on how to address people who are mentally ill. Mentally ill is a really interesting term to me. Who gets to define that? How do we define that? If we define it as a biochemical problem, where is the human being that we can connect to? And it's like there is a lot of evidence, irrefutable, that a lot of the medications we use are leading to higher and higher bits of disability in our country, not recovery. But one of the first things that's striking to me is when somebody's having a psychotic break in this place, in this region in Finland, they bring a team over. And people call them because they trust that they're going to get a good outcome. But you have a team of 3 people come over and they start going, asking questions, what's going on, what's happening. If there's any medication involved at that early stage, it might be sleep medicine. We recognize that some of the problems might be that person not had enough sleep. And that's the easiest solution for a lot of things. When they start trying to create some dialogue between all the people, because they recognize that a person with a mental illness is suffering from a burden of a problem in the communication. And the problem is not in the person, but in that in-between space. You think about what is the burden of a problem in communication. And I think about how children are. They bear the burden of problems in communication all the time. There's no way around that. And that's really, really good ethical communication. So I don't know what needs to happen here. I don't know the community very well here, but this is its unique community, and it's filled with a lot of unique people here. Different from Portland. Very different conditions, very different histories. So I guess the other thing that's really important to me that started making a lot of movement in Portland was actually when homeless people who live in a neighborhood started going to neighborhood councils. I started to see change because people going to neighborhood councils were really forced to see a human being and not a they. I don't know what the answers are, and I don't think just the people here on city council can solve that problem, or just these people over here or these people over there. I feel like it's a really big systemic problem, and it won't be solved until we get out of our system thinking that we're in. And I feel like it's difficult to get houseless people into inside of a building someplace, or to a location someplace. To really start going and dealing with houseless people, you have to go out to where they are and start those conversations out there. There are a lot of examples in some other cities about street medics going out and talking. And there's also a process of reporters can go out and talk. Volunteers can go out and talk to people. I don't know what beginnings are going to work, but I'm really into experimentation, small prototyping, and find some practices and experiment a little bit, because I don't know the answer, and I have a lot of experience, but I don't know the answer. Yeah, so that's it. So if anybody has questions, I do better with questions than one-on-one. So,
Mr. Constant.
Yeah, 2 things. You mentioned the Ionia project. Where is that? And really the substantive question is, how do self-organized groups of people ensure their own public safety and the safety of the community around it?
Ionia is in Kenai. I don't have the exact address. But how do communities do the organizing for security?
Self-organized.
Huh?
Self-organized for community homelessness.
Self-organized. I saw a lot of different unique solutions. So there's no one way. The last place I was staying at, they had a really big dog. He barked pretty loudly if somebody they didn't know came in. Woke everybody up. When there is a loud noise going on in the camp, all the people are feel able to get up, they get up, and they go deal with it. You know, surround the situation, watch what's going on. There's kind of people being involved with each other because there's nobody else to come help. In some of the other communities, the self-organization decided to have a gate and a surrounding, and there's people at that gate. And everybody serves on security. Everybody does a shift. You get 2 people.
How is that organized, Terry? Everyone does a shift.
Well, make a schedule, 2 hours, 4 hours, whatever the schedule is, do whatever you decide to do. But, yeah.
So you get commitment from
Yep.
the people. And
You have commitment or you don't live there.
how is that enforced?
Everybody. It's a group process.
Thank you.
And I'm just saying that each group would organize itself uniquely. Because we're all different. And when we bring a group of people together, they can interact with each other and create what they feel like they need.
Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned early on that in Portland they created their own paper.
The Street Roots, that's the name of their paper, Street Roots.
And so how did they afford to do that?
I'm sure there was some money and people interested in starting that process. I don't have exact history.
So they got training, and this was actually a printed paper?
It's a printed paper, yeah. And there's like a vendors, people go and sell them, and that's how homeless people can make some money.
Interesting.
And it encourages like no drinking on the job, and you know, it's like teaching people respect for the store owners or wherever place that they're at. Conflict is worked out by some of the people who are doing the paper. So there is people who are inside making part of that happen. And there's various cultures around that. It's an international movement of street papers. So there's one in Seattle, there's one in Vancouver, Canada. Actually, one of the distinguished Canadian persons of Canada is actually one of the writers on the Vancouver paper. He's a scientist, and he writes for that paper. And I'll remember David Suzuki, that's who it is. He is an author in that paper, Vancouver Street Paper.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. I had a question. Did you have a...
No, I was just my feet.
Okay. So, in my experience in organizing communities, and especially in the community that I belong to, the LGBT community, talking about your stories and your histories is critically important. And in my experience, there needs to be sort of an internal alignment before you can have an external alignment. And I just wanted you, if you could speak to your experience in that, because from my experience, before you can begin to even trust people outside of your community, you have to build that trust within. So if you could speak to that.
Well, I think about the Crumholts that grew up here, and this idea of integrity a lot. And the reasons why security was really important, because that's where, if they couldn't build that trust there wasn't going to be any other built trust. So it began on a very basic level of trust with each other. One of the rules in the houseless community is just not to get anybody's other business. Like, you don't have a house around you. You got to give people respect for their privacy, even though there's no house. And that is pretty well done. So that trust in that basic thing of security. If you weren't going to be stealing from your neighbor, you weren't going to be getting into fights and hurting people, and you were going to help participate, like doing security, you can stay there. The internal alignment of trust, it's like who in this room trusts themselves 100%? Yeah. How about 80%?
Thank you.
Ask a question.
Sure. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you said something which I think is correct, which is that people in the assembly can't solve this issue. You might be part of the solution, but it's obviously much broader than just us. But I was wondering if you had any specific policy suggestions for us, the things that have worked in other communities. Is there any specific kind of law that we could change or program we could fund that you think is particularly effective?
Well, I'm like this fundamental person that has a hard time with law. That's too much to memorize, one. And I've been following a lot of this idea of indigenous justice. Very different process than Western justice. So the whole process is related to reconciliation, circle process, the idea of healing rather than enforcing a punishment. That the process of bringing people together and talking with each other and mending, people do need to be held accountable. It's also victims need to be taken care of as well. So we have a lot of problems in our system of governance. And that's a history thing, where we've come out of. So I don't know if I could come up with laws that can make things right, because like every law has their exceptions.
Sure.
Yeah, except gravity. That's pretty basic. I understand gravity is a law.
It's interesting.
And if you're nice to people, they're generally nice back. If you're not afraid of people, there's an opening.
It's
And the opposite is true.
It's an interesting idea. I mean, there have been tribal courts and that kind of tribal justice sort of springing up around Alaska. I'm not sure if there's one active in Anchorage, actually.
We do have the therapeutic courts.
We have a
though.
therapeutic
Yeah,
court.
yeah.
but-
That's a model.
Well, yeah, but that is within the Western system of justice, and there have been a number of rural communities that have, and actually even in Fairbanks, I think, Tanana Chiefs Conference, I think, is setting
Yeah, it's
tribal court.
That's a kind of, I know at UAA Justice that they're starting to really look at that a lot more. So I'm encouraged by that.
It would be interesting though, because we have.
But laws, I think about, there are some really good possibilities of shifting the way you make decisions. That might be useful. Scotland has taken up this process called presency. It's online. You can find it online and go through a basic course about what it is. But basically, it's a different way of being in the room with each other and trying to solve problems. A lot of times we're doing talking, and it's all up here. We're downloading. We have this idea of like intellectual connection, what we're talking. We rarely have this part here of empathy. I mean, it's kind of like we're in our head, and it's harder to be in our hearts. But that's kind of where important dialogue happens, when we can connect and hear each other. We don't have to agree with anybody, but at least hearing each other about how somebody feels is really important. But we don't do that all the time. It's hard. It's a very intellectual system. But lastly, it's this whole idea of opening up our will to the possibilities that aren't here yet. And that's a creative thing. It's an artistic thing. It's not usually done in large spaces much. But you can look it up online and get a really quick lowdown on that. There's this whole idea of changing the way we're thinking together.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Constant.
So, Terry, this is maybe a more difficult conversation. There are people in the room who are living nearby places where people are encamped. And the encampments are not disciplined, they're not self-policing, and in fact, they're trashing the neighborhoods and causing conflicts and threatening people who are passing by and leaving out medical waste that's really scary for kids right next to playgrounds. And so, you know, there are the people who are encamped and the people in the neighborhoods, and somehow we have to have a conversation about how do we fix it so the encampments aren't there, or they're in a better place, or if they are there because we can't move them, how are they to be managed in such a way that our neighborhoods aren't shopping grounds for people who are filling their camps? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, my thoughts on that is I don't know exactly how people in this community would solve that together. I know it's really important to maybe come together and talk about it, but there needs to be people who are going to go out and talk to the people out there. I would volunteer to do that, but I don't want to just volunteer on my own. I have to have a place I'm reporting to, have a place to communicate with other people about it. I don't know if they have any street medics here. It's a special kind of training. I have medical background from being trained as a massage therapist, a couple of years in acupuncture school. So that's not huge. And I've done EMT and that kind of training. But going out by myself didn't seem like a smart thing for me right now. I have questions about what the Native community's involvement is this. I tried to find a little bit of stuff online, but I'm curious to go investigate in that area. In the other communities I've lived in, the Native community is often very much involved in housing and helping people. But like again, it's really unique up here. It's different. So I don't have the answer, but I think it would be like, how do you start communication process? Try and create more liaison. That to me is a beginning place. Those people who are really good at eliciting story and have some story projects going on, that starts to begin a process.
Okay, thank you so much. Any other questions for the speaker?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question about Dignity Village. I've read a little bit online about it, and it sounds like overall it's been successful. Started off as an encampment, still is an encampment, but now has cooking facilities and other facilities. How does that work? Is it run by, completely run by houseless folks, or is there a board? Or I mean, how do you regulate who comes in? I'm just curious as to
The nuts and bolts of that?
Yeah.
Okay. I could bring a video, you guys can watch this, about how it runs, the nuts and bolts, but I can go over some of the simple things. There are one shower, and there's about 50 people living there. You have one shower, one sink, and one hose hookup that they use to help water plants because they grow food there a little bit. The security is, everybody does security, and they have a little guard shack, right? And they have a gate that gets shut at night, so they have hours where they're open. Then there's a fence around the whole encampment. People live in tiny homes, various builds, various sizes, and the city gave them a little bit of a boundary around that. It needs to be up off the tarmac. It's not embedded into the ground. The tarmac is asphalt. So there's many different tiny homes. They're run and heated by propane. There was one main room where we had microwaves, coffee maker, that sort of thing. Refrigerator, just one. And then they got ice chest. The TV, movies, couches. When people wanted to stay there, they would call and they would come in and then have an interview. If there was space on the couch in the living room, they were allowed to sleep on the couch. And then they would move into a dorm which is one of the like tiny homes where it's divided in two. It's not their own single dwelling. It's kind of two structures together. So they had a lot of different committees people were helping on. Some of that's building repair, landscaping. We had a greenhouse that someone built for the community, so it was a greenhouse. The other thing that helped Dignity Village exist is this other organization called City Repair. And the founder of that, his name is Mark Lakeman. He was an outside advocate for Dignity Village when it started. And you can find many YouTubes about what he has to say about communities. And he's right now on a community organization in Portland that's working to create more and more self-organizing communities around Portland. So there's been a couple of them that have been put up since I've left. And that's called Village Coalition. And that's made of a lot of different people, including members who come in and visit from the city. Many people who are houseless are on that committee. You know, Portland has some really intense organizers who are members of the community who took it into their own hands to do a lot of outreach. There's a team of people called Boots on the Ground. They were the nurses. They would go out and talk to people. What do you need? Portland also has a safe needle exchange in downtown. You know, that's one of the ways to get rid of needle waste is like help teach people. It's like if you're going to do needles, here's a place you can drop it off. I think the whole idea of illegalizing drugs is kind of trying to stop the problem from the wrong root. People take drugs because their lives are very, very unhappy and painful. Until we address that, yeah. And I think this gentleman like Gabor Mate from Canada says some really elucidating things about addictions that I think would be real simple people to listen. That's on YouTube.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. France. All right, any other questions? Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned something about street medics. Are these people that have like former medical training in the military or something like that? Or
Nope. Yeah, I think it was like Philadelphia or Boston, when the cities are actually utilize medics to go out into the streets and meet with houseless people.
like EMT?
Help keep track, help them keep track of where they are. Because in the houseless community, records get lost, appointments don't get made. Because, like, if you don't go to work, half the time you don't know what day it is. So keeping track and getting people on time to court is something really challenging too, sometimes. But yeah, living in a different reality. So people going out and meeting with people out there and checking them. You know, it's like in Portland, there are street medics are trained, but they don't have it as a system in Portland. These are volunteers. And like I said, the nurses that go out, they're volunteers. And they're advocates, very strong, passionate advocates. And I know that one of the things that really started to change in Portland was Right to Dream 2 when it got founded, and they're right at downtown by the China Gate. It happened at the same time Occupy was going on. So we had a lot of allies at the very beginning of that project. And the system was very busy with Occupy. If Occupy was not there, that would have been shut down very fast. But it stayed there. And the people from that community, part of their contribution there was to go and speak their stories to City Hall. And those are recorded. Their meetings are on Wednesdays. People driving by and walking by more, people will walk by and go, what's this? And I have a houseless person and a house person talking. Those small things were really big in making a change in Portland. And the people, after they went and spoke to City Hall, it changes them. You're a houseless person going, speaking their story to important people. Those are powerful things that happen. And that small group, with a lot of the advocacy, challenged the city. The city fined them for camping without a recreational license. Find them and find them and find them and find them. And so Right to Dream 2 sued the city back and won. So there's about history that happens, and people can be organized to that level.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Sure, Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one final question. In terms of the self-organizing, it sounds like a big component of it is survival. I mean, how to establish security in the area you're camping. Is there also, and I imagine this could vary depending on the community, would you say there's also a long-term plan or a goal of being a housed individual?
Each person has their own dreams. And that's a difficult question. I think their dreams become a lot more basic. So a lot of times, I just want a place to live. Then the other part is that I saw in Dignity Village, people there, they should really, a lot of them just wanted to stay there. That was their family. I mean, that becomes a lot of support. People make really, really good friends with each other. In long-term solution from the city side, city is just like leaves Dignity Village alone. Which is some of where, personally, I wanted to do things differently if I was going to be part of trying to set something up. You know, housed and unhoused people working together is vital. And it's kind of this whole thing about watching and seeing improvement. Because improvement happens when people are able to be less isolated, they get sleep, they feel safe.
Thank you, Ms. France. Mr. Dunbar.
I have a question about the sort of a term. You're using the term housed and unhoused instead of person experiencing homelessness, which is sort of what we've been using here. Why do you prefer housed and unhoused versus person experiencing homelessness?
Because they're human beings. If we knew what all our neighbors did without those housed walls, we'd be shocked. We would be.
Yeah, but
And in a lot of ways, I see that a lot of women in our community and a lot of children in our community, I sure wish they had eyes on them. And like one of the differences is just to really acknowledge if somebody does not have a house to live behind. If we can see that fundamental difference, it will help a lot. Homeless is like, I don't have a home. Like, no, people have a home, it's where they're at. It's their tent or their tarp or where they are that night. And I've always felt well at home wherever I was at. And to tell the truth, I felt safer out there. All the places I was supposed to be safe in my life were not safe for me. And that's the case for a lot of people. But they continue to stay behind the walls because they're afraid of all of that out there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
But I like to see more statistics about things. Those are really useful things too. There's a professional down in Portland named Vahid Brown. He works for not Portland City, but another neighboring city. But he's one of the advocates that goes out and actually gets the details because he's got the education to do that and the will to do that. Yeah, you can find him on Facebook if you want to look for him and talk to him because he's very good at talking to people.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Okay, so I definitely want to thank you for coming here. I know this is a topic that Mr. Constant has been very passionate about, and you know, I have wanted to figure out how to enhance the voice that just hasn't been at the table. So thank you for providing us with some good comments and ideas. I hope you can stay for the remainder of the meeting because I'm going to open it up to audience participation after we're done with our next business item, and some audience members might have some questions. So moving on to the AO draft that was just given. Thank you. This is basically the amendment. On page 3, you'll find the changes that are made to the AO underlined. I have some folks from the administration that I'd like to come up to speak to this and some of the questions and concerns that were brought up yesterday.
You're going to get a group of us.
Sure.
I'm sure if you wanted me to revisit, I mean, the question I raised last night was only whether or not what was in the code. This code is very specific, I think extraordinarily so, in terms of how much detail it goes into about who notifies who. And so my question last night was only whether, of the various folks involved in the abatement process, whether it was actually DHHS who should be giving notice to community councils, practically speaking, based on who does. Working last night, it seems at the point at which this came up, all the interested parties were not present. So now it's like you have Carson, and you've got Melina from the local intervention team, you have Steve from DHHS. So I think these folks, I guess the question is, in the notice process, who makes the most sense to be giving notice to the community council? Is that something the CAP team should do when notice is given to DHHS, or does it make sense for DHHS to give notice to community councils? Is that a local intervention team function? If that's a request of the assembly that notice is given to community councils, who should do that?
I guess the important part is we want notice being made to the community councils, right? I guess I would just caution with ordinances, when we start getting so specific, it doesn't allow for adaptation for efficiency, I think, because we're going to electronic. I think soon the notice can easily be made just by electronic. Every time we get ready to go make a notice, we just post on the website, it sends out notice to all the different councils, things like that. So I don't think we should be specific in the actual thing, just saying that notice shall be made, and then it puts the responsibility on those doing the process to make sure that that happens. Rather, if we get too specific, then it locks us into something. We're coming back for little changes on the ordinance over and over and over. But I think we should just word it as it shall be made, and then if we can come up with an efficient electronic version, which I believe we're very close to, would be very easy to do. That would be my suggestion on that. So every time, just like we went electronic with our posting, and we're kind of working with Nancy on revamping, the notices back to the people who are reporting the camps, in addition to the volunteer groups who trying to create a system when someone wants to volunteer to pick up, they can go online and do it that way. I think it makes sense to have this system that can just notify, like I said, community councils and everybody.
All right.
And Mr. Chairman, currently the department receives notification of the camp cleanups currently, but with the broader a zone notification. We know ahead of time where it's going to be posted. And at that time, we can determine what community councils are affected and incorporate that into our process.
Thank you. Mr. Trainee had a question.
Mr. Chairman, most community councils already have electronic notification.
Mhm.
They've all got emails. We live in a connected world.
Yep.
There's 38 of them, and so it's just a matter of you contacting, setting up a process. I don't care who does it. I just want to make sure it's done. Okay?
We understand and agree.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee. Mr. Constant.
Hi there. So on page 3, letter D, item 1, I think that we would be wise to soften that a little bit and add the word general, the general location of the camp. Right, because our system is very specific, and there are reasons why we don't give exact pinpoint locations for these places broadly. And so I think that we would be wise just to add the word general there, which allows the administration to exercise judgment on the exact location.
I guess question to Ms. Wynn Pearson, does that satisfy the concern that Mr. Constant brought up?
Yeah, I think that Lieutenant Carson's suggestion addresses the concern that I had raised last night. I would agree with that phrasing, just to say that any to recraft this language to state that notice shall be provided and not specify who gives the notice.
Sure.
And whether or not you want to give specific or general notice of location to community councils, I think is up to you. I think that the specific notice, the way the intent of this original paragraph was regarding notice to service providers who might provide services to the individuals before camps are abated. And so in that instance, specificity is necessary. In respect to the community councils, I think that's up to you whether you want to balance kind of the question of specificity against just general notice. There are going to be areas in your community council region that they did in the coming weeks.
If I can follow, I think it's fair to say there's a zone between this street and that street, that street and that street, but to say a camp at this point, mark 111.00 north, 752, it's a problem to me. That's the way we have to be careful, and that could be interpreted that way.
Certainly, I think the way it's structured now, it says to inform the community councils for the area for a zone abatement. So the notice is only given to community councils in this current drafting for a zone abatement, not an individual campsite abatement. Okay. So they would get that description that we've talked about, kind of the reasonably compact area and the defining cross streets and geographic landmarks.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Mr. Trainee.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Chris, I think it's much like Nixle. You're in Nixle.
Yeah.
It doesn't tell you exactly where.
Right, and that's great.
And they can do this, but we do have some people from the community councils. If you want to get their point of view on this, you might ask them.
Yeah, thank you. I will go to them in a second. Any other questions from anyone here? No? Okay. So does anyone representing a community council want to speak to this particular amendment? Sure.
I'm still here for Campbell Park Community Council, and in a recent meeting I complained that the city does not seem to care to locate camps. They depend on citizens to locate camps and report them, and this takes away a great deal of accountability. In our neighborhood, in the deep woods, we have camps that are very fluid. They move about, and they're not receptive to social services. They want to be isolated. They want to be removed from any kind of interaction with the community. We really need to have the city to locate and identify camps, and then take responsible action for abatement. And if there isn't a reporting system that describes this whole process, how is it going to be accountable?
Thank you. I think, yes, sir.
I'm not here representing a community council, I'm just a citizen. I happen to be the citizen who made the suggestion to create a system of accountability. I think I appreciate the spirit in which this amendment is offered to create some degree of accountability. I can tell you that it's less important, frankly, to inform a community council when you're about to abate. Residents of a community will know when you're abating. I think the important thing is demonstrating long-term accountability. In other words, for citizens to be able to track and know when camps are identified, how long it takes to get them noticed, how long it takes between the notice and the identification, or the notice and the cleanup, and then when sites are reoccupied, and be able to track trends over time, so that we can understand, are we having more or fewer camps, or are we being effective or ineffective? And being able to track how we do that is a useful thing. It gives accountability to all of us. It gives us information upon which we can better advocate and better understand the actions of our community. So the specific notice of an abatement is less important than an overall system that allows us to, me for instance, I've reported many camps. The net result of that is I get potentially months later an email from the mayor's office telling me that a camp either has been abated or cannot be because it's on private property. It identifies the camp only by a number. There's no overall data to let me know of the 200 camps that I've reported, how many of them have been noticed, abated, and cleaned, in what time frame that has occurred. I'm left to try to gather that information from random emails that I receive.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Constant.
Thank you. Russ, Mr. Webb, this amendment is just a cleanup from a late process last night.
I got it. I
And
watched it.
the 12-point discussion will be next month at this meeting, and we'll start digging into the items that are on that list to come up with strategies to approach what we can and what the resources are, et cetera. And I just, a point of irony, at the meeting last Monday, people were talking about how some of the failings of the administration are that they just work on data, right? Data, but what I just heard you ask for was data. And so, because that is really the crunch, the kingpin of being able to make good decisions is good data. And so, I just want to point out the irony and say thank you for continuing to come and be part of this process, because we're making movement now.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Sure, go ahead. Oh, actually, Mr. Peterson, and then we'll go to Ms. Chase.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I was going to ask Lieutenant Carson, if, I think it's Lieutenant, correct?
Yes.
If he could explain to us how much time he and the rest of the CAP team are working tagging camps, and what other responsibilities you have besides that to give members of the community an idea of what your situation is.
So our CAP team's about 15 people. Half of them are split, and includes 2 supervisors. Half of them are split doing crime suppression. So they go out there and they're the ones, like the operation you guys heard about last week. They're going out there and they're going out some parking lots, doing drug enforcement, just stuff like that. We're out there and trying to get monsters and stuff. But then the side that deals with the campsite is only 4 officers and 1 supervisor. With that, they have all the ADD addresses, so anything that comes in on an address that is, for excessive calls, things like that. It's that group that does that. We kind of got that group split in 2, so really 2 people mainly handle on the ADD, the nuisance addresses, and they go to community council meetings, bike rodeos, any request that comes in, it all comes to that group of 4, 5 with the supervisor. Then they got 2 officers that are kind of spearheading the notifying camps, the shelter, the shelter issues, the shelter campus down there, going down there, helping with the issues down there. is stretched thin in a lot of ways, as far as any time a constituent calls in, and then it gets forwarded to the mayor's office, it comes down, we want this house addressed with. It's not as easy as just going up and knocking on a door and all of a sudden, poof, the house is fixed. There's no more calls for service there. Each house takes an enormous amount of time. A lot of times it takes surveillance, we'll just sit, we'll watch it, we'll do traffic stops of people coming and going, see if we can come up with a drug case or other stolen property, things like that. Or if that doesn't work, we can work with code enforcement, trying to get the place maybe abated. Like I said, each address takes an enormous amount of time, and those requests are coming in constant. We get a lot of them coming in every week. As you guys know, you guys are sending them down to us, and we try and address them as quick as we can. So it's, we do our best to kind of address the question about officers out there just looking and finding camps and posts. When they go into areas to post camps, they do that. They go out there and they post the reported camps, and then they also walk the area for known areas that our camps are, and then in addition they post those camps and put them into the system. And we are more accurately than I think we ever have with collector, tracking camps that have been reported and their locations, not only with the geo marker on the actual location, but actually photographs that kind of mark the camp and what the structure is, so that at the end of each year basically gets wiped off the main layer, but it's stored there that we can go back year after year after year and really see where our main problem areas are, and then maybe work with the assembly, things like that. Once we start getting near the data on things we can do to reduce the camps in the area, like I know Ms. Chase has been involved in going out to kind of clear cutting, raising brush, things like that allow us to try and reduce the camps in the area. So there's a lot going on as far as the data wise. It's just recently we really come up with a system to accurately collect that data. So it will take some time over years to, before we really have recommendations before we go and cut a whole bunch of trees down in an area. We want to see a couple of years of stats that are showing that this is a problem area, not just a trend for a short time. So.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Ms. Chase.
Yes. First of all, I want to say I'm from Rogers Park Community Council, and our Crime and Safety Committee is called Take Back Our Community. And I just want to say I totally agree with Brian and Russ. And also, I have a couple of questions. Number one, is there a map available of all the prohibited illegal encampments just along Chester Creek Trail? I'm asking.
Sure. So it's my understanding that there is a map that does not provide data specific locations, but just sort of provides sort of hot spots and general terms of where the camps are located.
Well, I've tried to get that, and it's impossible to get. And it's not like our community council or the people in Rogers Park want to go and, as vigilantes or anything. But that's an important piece for every community to know. And we have mapped earlier this summer the encampments from Lake Otis to New Seward Highway. And a couple of the other community councils have said that they are also going to map. So don't worry, Muni. We're going to take care of this job. We're going to get a map, at least on the Chester Creek Trail, and then we will share it with you, and we will share it with next door. I think that's an important aspect for each of these community councils and their ensuing community to know. And I don't understand what the great fear is with the Muni. I just don't understand. Anyway, in listening to Lieutenant Carson, we've had lots of conversations, very responsive. also very responsive. But if we look at this situation of trying to identify, trying to abate these encampments, and we're having a lot of problems with stealing, with drugs, biohazards, all kinds of things. So it doesn't sound to me like it's, you know, the congenial, everybody's gonna talk together, or that kind of thing. I believe in communication. It doesn't seem like we're in the, I don't know, the whole country is not communicating. But anyway, we're upside down where we have put our resources. We have perhaps 2 people, 2 police officers and a supervisor who are dealing with these encampments. They need a lot more. In talking with several of the CAP team, they would like to have more social workers with them and about 4 more officers to deal with. And the other aspect where we're upside down is with Parks and Rec. We've allowed them 15 people to clean up these encampments. 15 people. I don't understand that. That's impossible. Maybe that's the idea. I don't know. But that's an impossible number to do the job in a timely way. We're not going to be, unless a lot of what Russ has presented is going to be part of building this comprehensive plan. I suggest we're not going to have anything different next year. Nothing's going to get done this summer. And I don't like that. As a tax-paying citizen, I don't like that. My assembly, our mayor, I don't feel that you are doing the job that this community wants done.
Thank you.
Nobody's listening.
Thank you, Ms. Chase. I think Mr. Trainee has a question or comment.
Like 2 meetings ago, I asked for that same map for this community council. I've yet to see it from Nancy. And I'll ask next time we have a meeting, because they're either trying to hide it or they don't have it. I want to know one or the other. Because I've got community councils that want to map the homeless shelters, homeless camps. So, do what you can.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee. Okay, any other community councils here to comment? Are you here representing a community council?
I'm president of the Little Bit Community Council, and I'm in the process of becoming part of the Turnagain Community Council.
But are you a current representative of a community council right now?
No, but in 1 minute I give
Okay.
you 12 solutions.
Well,
to
sure. So
questions
we're going to be opening up to public comment here soon, and I invite you to participate in that. So,
I'm sorry, so you noticed at 12:30 or 12?
So we were noticed at 12, but after consulting with Mr. Trainee and our staff here, I wanted to go just a few more additional minutes because we don't have another meeting here, if that's okay with the body. I won't keep us here for too much longer. All right. So any other questions or comments on this? I'll go ahead and work with Mr. Gates to take those suggestions into account and modify this, have this on the agenda for our first meeting in July, for introduction at least. Okay, so then we're going to move on to audience participation. Just have a few minutes for audience participation. Who would like to come forward and testify?
I'd like to follow up.
Sure.
I understand Mr. Council's objection to identifying sites, but the more vague the information, the less accountable the action. And just as in law enforcement, if you had a house, a structure that was the source of an awful lot of law enforcement, you want to identify that house and become accountable for abating the problem. If you don't identify these sites and identify the actions taken to abate them, we in the public are just left not knowing if anything's going on. We can't see that anything's being done. I mean, in our own case, Rogers Park, Campbell Park, we report things over and over again. We don't see them taken care of for sometimes months, and we don't know why it's not being done.
Thank you. I think Mr. Constant had a.
Since you brought my name up, this will sort out. We're in the process of that right now, getting to figure out what the procedures are, how the communications are to be made. But I will assure you that when you go to APD's crime mapping, they do not identify a specific location where an incident occurred. They just don't. And there are a lot of reasons why you don't, and I think we have to be equally cautious. And so we'll get as specific as we can to achieve the agreed upon goals. But even with the most up-to-date crime reporting that happens all the time, we don't say at 324 East 9th Avenue, we might say the 300 block of 9th Avenue. And we have to be careful. We just have a duty to every stakeholder in this equation. And I would stand on that.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Would anyone else like to testify? Yes.
With all due respect, I feel like we're wasting valuable time. Mr. Dunbar asked a very valuable question, or important question, and the answers are in this room. The time for talk is long over. What we need is a task force, not a committee. FedEx taught us that when you want to solve a problem, you have to first find out what the problem is. And you can find out what the problem is by asking why. When you can no longer ask why, you have the problem. If you give resources to the symptoms, the problem grows larger. If you give resources to the problem, the symptoms go away. We have to find out what the problem really is. And part of the problem is people don't have shelter, water, food, medicine, or something worthwhile to do, money, etc. This body has the power to embolden and empower this body to bring forth the solutions, to plan the work, and to work the plan, and to see those solutions happen instead of talking about them. Talking is the second most primitive form of communication next to warfare. It's time for action. And there's at least a dozen solutions right now that I could rattle off.
Thank you, sir. Would anyone else like to testify? Okay, seeing none, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.